Ralph Moore is a final year PhD candidate at Trinity College Dublin, Ireland, though originally from the United Kingdom. His research thesis is entitled Keeping Up with the Julii, Roman Impact on Social Stratification and Mobility in the Rhone Basin between 125 and 10 BCE, and is supervised by Dr. Hazel Dodge. Ralph's presentation today is entitled Friends in High and Low Places, the Allobroges and the Politics of Patronage and Provincial Society in the Late Roman Republic. Ralph.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me to be here. And thank you to the Malta Classics Association for setting up this amazing conference so far. I have attached a handout with sources and bibliography in the chat, which I hope everyone can see and download for themselves at their leisure. I will just begin my PowerPoint and then we can start. In this paper, I intend to offer a brief analysis of how the institution of Roman patron-client relations affected political relationships with the Roman state in the late Republic and early Principate, when provided to conquered subject populations through the right of deditio in fidem, the formal act of surrender by which they made peace and transferred their sovereignty under Roman law to another, focusing on the Allobroges as a case study. The Allobroges were a people of the southeast Gaul. Their territory, so far as we can tell, extended from the eastern bank of the river Rhone, just south of its confluence with the Saône, up into what are now the French Alps. Though the earliest reference to them is found in Polybius in the context of Hannibal's march towards the Alps in the late 3rd century BCE, the majority of their appearances in the canon of Greek and Latin literature relate to the period from the late 2nd century BCE through the turn of the millennium to the early 1st century CE. The Allobroges were brought under Roman domination through their conquest circa 121 BCE. This came as part of a series of larger series of wars in southern Gaul. Following his defeat at Roman hands a few years previously, Tutomotulus, king of the Saluvii, had apparently fled into exile among the Allobroges and was gathering resources for a bid to retake his kingdom. Circa 123 to 2 BCE, a conflict erupted between the Roman Republic and an alliance of Gallic peoples including the Allobroges, exiled Saluvian dissidents, and the wealthy and powerful Arverni of the Massif Central to the west. Sadly, most accounts of this war are only preserved in the epitomized sections of historians such as Livy, Appian, and Diodorus, though what little text we do possess speaks of a great battle at Vindalum, near the confluence of the rivers Rhone and Sorgue, claiming tens of thousands of casualties and netting its victor a triumph. Despite the fact that the majority of campaigning to secure the area had been undertaken by forces under proconsul Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, the leaders of the Allobroges opted instead to perform the rite of deditio in fidem to sitting consul Quintus Fabius Maximus, who had primarily been fighting their allies the Arverni. This technical victory secured him the honorary cognomen Allobrogicus, and the establishment of patron-client relations between the Allobroges, himself, and his descendants for decades to come. The choice to seek the patronage of Fabius over Ahenobarbus is not elucidated in any surviving text. Possible factors may have included a certain amount of spite in ensuring that the kudos of their defeat went to someone other than the man who had crushed their forces at Vindalum, and a desire to avoid being too under the thumb of Ahenobarbus, whose construction project of the Via Domitia, a road from the Alps to the Pyrenees, gave him enormous control and influence over southern Gaul for the next few years. However strategic this choice may have appeared in 121 BCE, though, the patronage of the gens Fabia proved to be a mixed blessing for the Allobroges over the next few decades. In 69 BCE, a young Cicero defended Marcus Fonteius against charges of extortion and corruption of office under the Lex Cornelia de Repetundis in his capacity as pro-praetorian governor of Gallia Transalpina circa 73 to 1 BCE, brought against him by a coalition of Gallic peregrini, seemingly chief among them a contingent of Allobroges headed by their dux indutio maros. Though a clear record of the prosecution's case does not survive, from Cicero's rebuttals, it appears to have been focused on the governor's demands for money and appropriation of land in Allobrogan territory. His actions were justified, the defense argued, on the basis that rather than feathering his own nest, the money raised by Fonteius was to pay the auxiliary troops he had levied from the region, sent to aid the war effort in Spain under Pompey the Great at the time, while the land had been lawfully confiscated from local rebels and troublemakers to be rendered ager Romanus, as was traditional protocol. The problem, essentially, was that as a governor imbued with imperium, Fonteius was entirely within his rights to bleed a province dry, so long as it was seen to be for the benefit of the Roman state rather than for himself alone, and as long as he did not violate the rights of Roman citizens in the process. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that, in addition to governmental demands on their resources, the Allobroges and other Gauls were plagued by a rash of predatory, usurious loan agreements from Roman merchants, or negotiatores, active in the province. What is notable here is that despite a seemingly high-profile senatorial trial in which the Allobroges as a conquered nation are deeply implicated, a Fabian patron to defend their interests is nowhere to be found. The case of the prosecution is instead argued by the otherwise obscure Marcus Praetorius. Though the record is partially fragmented, we can reasonably assume that, as a recorded Ciceronian oration, albeit an early one, this is a case that Praetorius lost, and the Allobrogan witnesses he called went home disappointed. The Allobroges make their next appearances in an episode far more crucial to the politics of the Republic, as players in the drama of the Second Catilinarian Conspiracy in 63 BCE. Sallust's account of the event emphasizes that, as the conspirators were gathering their forces for a planned coup, envoys from the Allobroges were in Rome, pleading to the Senate for relief from the oppressive burden of debt placed on them by a combination of provincial taxes and the frequently exploitative practices of Italian negotiatores and their senatorial backers. As debt cancellation was a central plank of the conspirators' aims for the new regime, the Gauls' pleas for aid had repeatedly fallen on unsympathetic ears, and the famed Allobrogan cavalry would complement Catiline's infantry-based forces in Etruria. It would appear to be a match made in Elysium. The Gauls, however, were more cautious and perhaps wiser than expected, and, rather than risk entanglement in a conflict they might live to regret, opted to become witnesses against the conspiracy instead. In contrast with the trial of Fonteius, a Fabian patron of the Allobroges makes his appearance here, willing and able to meet certain obligations to his clients. Quintus Fabius Sanga, in his patronal capacity, played host to the envoys at his house, acted as confidant in their disclosure of the conspirators' plot, and safely passed the information on to Cicero and his agents. Although they had just rendered the Republic, which ruthlessly dominated them, a great service, any overtures from the Allobroges to improve their lot appear to have fallen on deaf, or at least ungrateful ears. A year or two later, a revolt broke out in Allobrogan territory under the leadership of a man named Catugnatos. Due to the characteristically fragmentary historical record, the motivations and aims of the uprising are unreported and difficult to reconstruct with any confidence. The reasonable assumption, however, has tended to be that the ongoing debt crisis had gone too long unalleviated and pushed the locals into desperate action. The resulting conflict came to a head at the Battle of Salonium, whose location remains a matter of debate in archaeological circles, in which Catugnatos' rebellion was put down and the area was likely subject to a renewed round of reprisals and land confiscations, worsening rather than ameliorating the problems besetting the Allobroges as provincial subjects. An issue we see here is that, in spite of its implied reciprocity, patronage entailed by deditio infidem did not guarantee a patron's support at all times, while the shifting tides of senatorial politics and aristocratic family fortunes meant that the amount of influence a patron could wield varied significantly. Quintus Fabius Sanga, it must be noted, is only securely identified in his one appearance in extant texts, and thus does not appear to have led a noteworthy or successful career. As a side note, Allobrogicus' grandson, similarly named Quintus Fabius Maximus, would eventually secure himself a consulship in 45 BCE, but his career in the Senate does not appear to have begun until 59. The Allobroges' patron during their tribulations could give them some succor when obliged to, but without the dignitas of high office and or support of an influential faction, his advocacy was of limited, if any, use in improving their political situation. Though the Fabii were, by ancestral right, patrons of the Allobroges as a group, certain families within the nation were able to secure patronage, and its attendant benefits, from other sources within the Roman elite of the late Republic. Gaius Valerius Flaccus, whose consulship in 80 BCE appears to have been followed by a stint as governor of Transalpina in the early 70s, was a seemingly prolific patron and sponsor of enfranchisement to Roman citizenship among the peoples of southern Gaul. He left several emergent dynasties of Valerii amongst the elite of the province, some members of which we will discuss in a moment, most likely as rewards to leaders of auxiliary regiments he employed while in office. For a clearer example of this trend, we can observe the epitomes of the historian Pompeius Trogus, recounting that the original author was a member of the Vacontii nation, neighbours of the Allobroges in southeastern Gaul, whose grandfather had been enfranchised by Pompey the Great in return for military services. The fact that there appear to have been no Fontei emerging in southern Gaul, despite the large numbers of levied troops from the region, might further illustrate the dysfunctionality of his tenure as governor in its lack of expected reciprocity of services. Notably, although there was at least one member of the Valerii, later identified as Gaius Valerius Caburus, among the Allobrogan elite during the era of Fonteius' trial and the Catilinarian conspiracy, neither he nor his sponsor appear to have played any role in them. It is instead the seemingly unenfranchised Indutio Maros, whom Cicero wastes no time in caricaturing as the worst kind of ignorant, impious, thuggish barbarian, who acts as the chief witness to the abuses suffered by his people in 69 BCE. As citizens, Caburus and his family would have been exempt from many of the impositions placed on Peregrini by the governorate, but unless we can imagine that they were indifferent to the suffering of their peers for whatever reason, the suggestion would appear to be that they had neither enough standing within provincial or metropolitan Roman society to meaningfully affect the situation. The Valerii's apparent absence from narratives of the Catilinarian conspiracy, a time when the Allobroges needed advocates and power brokers in Rome more than ever, further suggests that being an enfranchised citizen of provincial extraction, even one of high standing in one's own nation, with a patron at Rome, did not necessarily translate into the ability to advance or even protect the interests of one's non-citizen people in the face of Roman dominance and exploitation. As a further side note, this may have been an issue with Allobrogan political structures themselves, which, like many of their neighbours, may have been more oligarchic than monarchic, meaning that, in contrast with provincial client kings, as they are sometimes called, the enfranchisement of one out of many local chieftains would not, by itself, mark a major shift in power dynamics. The Allobroges' his bleak situation began to turn, perhaps ironically, when war came to their doorstep. Gaius Julius Caesar's accession as proconsular governor of Gallia Transalpina in 58 BCE saw him launching into war with Gallic peoples north of the province. On two occasions during the resulting years of campaigning, Caesar framed himself as a defender of the Allobroges against attackers from abroad. In the first, a Roman garrison is said to have protected the Allobrogan town of Genava, modern Geneva, from the depredations of the migrating Helvetii. In the second, in 52 BCE, Caesar's forces repulsed the rebel forces of Vercingetorix after the Allobroges, seemingly true to form, had rejected his overtures to join him in throwing off the shackles of Roman oppression. Caesar's commentaries also relate multiple instances wherein he took members of the Allobrogan aristocracy into his service. One of these was Gaius Valerius Procillus, the son of Caburus, a young man described as preeminent among the Gauls of the province and a particular friend of Caesar himself. In 58 BCE, he first acted as Caesar's interpreter for the concilium of all Gauls he convened after the defeat of the Helvetii, and then as a picked envoy/spy to the Germanic warlord Ariovistus. This latter venture saw him briefly imprisoned, abused, and threatened with a fate of human sacrifice before his fortuitous rescue by Roman forces. In his account of the civil war against Pompey circa 49 to 7 BCE, Caesar describes how the Allobrogan brothers, Agos and Rucilos, sons of Adbucilus, had served him with distinction for several years as cavalry officers. In exchange for their service and loyalty, he had rewarded their formerly impoverished family with gifts of landed estates, very possibly some of the same confiscated by Fonteius decades ago, and money. Despite this largesse, however, during the siege of Dyrrachium, the brothers were discovered to be embezzling from their troops' wages and defected to the Pompeian side to avoid Caesar's wrath. They apparently met their fate on the field at Pharsalus. Though Caesar did not strictly take the place of the Fabii as ancestral patron to the Allobrogan nation as a whole, Developing patronal relations with many of their aristocrats during his unusually long and influential tenure as provincial governor, and in the use of loyalties he had cultivated in his turn to civil war afterwards, he radically departed from the pre-established norms of provincial government and its impact on the local population. We have no record of what, other than a grant of citizenship, Valerius Flaccus gave his clients in Gallia Transalpina before returning to Rome. If we can take Caesar at his word that he did bestow lands and cash upon not merely a handful of individual elites, but to a broad array of the Allobrogan nobility as a whole, the impact of his contributions were on a different order of magnitude. Their crisis alleviated and their status elevated by Caesar's aid, the Allobroges continued to prosper under his successors. During the closing years of the 1st century BCE and after the turn of the millennium, the Allobrogan power center of Viana, modern Vienne, developed into a large and wealthy Gallo-Roman city, only dwarfed in the region by Lugdunum, modern Lyon, to the north, as the new hub of Roman Gaul, and the Mediterranean gateway port of Arelate, modern Arles, to the south. Under its Julio-Claudian patronage, the city received the status of Colonia, granting it legal parity with Rome itself. The precise date and circumstances of its elevation are disputed, with Augustus and Caligula being the preferred candidates for the sponsoring emperor. The newly renamed province of Gallia Narbonensis was, as one of the senatorial provinces, still under the jurisdiction of proconsular or pro-praetorian governors rather than imperial appointees, but from then on the chief settlement of the Allobroges would no longer be subject to their whims. In 35 CE, Decimus Valerius Asiaticus, an Allobrogan, presumably a descendant of Valerius Caburus and a native of Viana, became the first Gaul to hold a Roman consulship. Under the Principate, a member of the nation Cicero had once used his rhetoric to denigrate and urged his audience to banish from the city, would now walk its streets as leader of the Senate. Similarly, the epigraphic record of the settlement speaks to the existence of local Julii dynasties, originally enfranchised either by Caesar or Augustus as part of the fabric of community, as they were in many parts of early Roman Gaul. The case study of the Allobroges and their relations with provincial government under the late Republic and early Principate through the lens of patron-client relations complicates certain traditional narratives about the nature of Roman rule. The enfranchisement of loyal local elites with citizenship and the potential of assimilation into Roman society was not a straightforward recipe for securing the pacification and support of conquered peoples. Furthermore, as we have seen, the shifting power structures of the senatorial oligarchy meant that even strategically seeking the patronage of a great scion of a noble house, such as Fabius Maximus Allobrogicus, could fail to pay off in the long run if their dynasty did not maintain a consistently high level of prestige. Since they could not rely on their national patron to sway things in their favor at Rome, and other senatorial patrons may not take on enough of or the right clients from among their community to make a meaningful difference, the only options left to them were to either send envoys to appeal directly to the Senate or to turn to armed conflict against Roman forces, neither of which were likely to succeed. What proved far more crucial to the long-term stabilization of the region was the institution of a system that allowed patrons and their dynastic successors to avoid the pitfalls and vagaries of the cursus honorum, i.e. the imperial monarchy. As long as they could maintain a cordial relationship with the presiding triumvir, dictator, or princeps, the Allobroges and other provincial subject populations would no longer be forced to address Roman abuses by either fruitlessly appealing to an indifferent Senate or hopelessly fomenting rebellion. Thank you for listening.